Greetings and welcome to my channel. This is Sorcerer Tal. You can also find me on Facebook in the Sorcerers Guild. Today on Magical Theory and Unorthodox Weirdery, we are going to be talking about the concept of self. Now, because with the concept of self, we are going to be talking about the soul and bordering on religious matters, I would like to remind you that nothing I say on the Unorthodox Weirdery playlist should be taken as official guild policy or position on any matter. Okay, so now that that is out of the way, what is the self? The thing that first comes to mind with most people when you talk about the concept of self is the ego. And that is what that literally is our concept of self. Now, what most people don't realize is that this is a malleable thing. Yeah, our ego can be intentionally shaped. This idea of finding ourselves. Yeah, you've heard this idea of finding yourself? Well, I mean, there's some validity to that, some understanding of the self, but really, for the sorcerer and those who are practice paradigm shifting, it is less about finding yourself and more about creating yourself, yeah? Once you've learned to understand your will, then you can form your ego in accordance to that will. The ego can be seen as an aspect of our astral form. Yeah, I talk a lot about having a cohesive astral form, and that's part of the self as well. And in order to have that cohesive astral form, we want to have a good sense of who we are, who we have created ourselves into being. Yeah, because it isn't, like I said, this idea of creating the self over finding the self. We really don't have much choice in this. We are going to grow as people, positively or negatively. Yeah, not all growth is good. Yeah, we can find ourselves growing out, but this is an aspect of ourselves that we can culture. And this is why we do the meditations. This is why we do the shadow work. Yeah, I talk a lot about shadow work in a previous video and the idea of actually talking to yourself. And that's what we're dealing with here, is this concept of self. That's a big part of what we're dealing with when we're talking to the self, is learning to understand who we are and then building upon that. Yeah? Because I just said that it's creating the self, but you still have to work with the building blocks that you have. So there's some understanding or finding of the self involved in that. But let's go beyond this concept of ego. For me, the self is primarily divided into three concepts. In the Egyptian Book of the Dead, they divide the soul itself into many different levels. And there is some value in that. And when we are working with that system, we want to get into those smaller, more finer definitions or layers. But for me, there are three major separations. And these are the old philosophical cliches of mind, body, soul, which are the same as the three aspects of existence. Yeah, and we have a self on each one of these aspects. So we have the mental plane. This is the plane of thought, the transfer of information, which I've talked about in other videos. We have a self that exists there. We have the mental version of ourselves. A lot of people tend to think of this as the higher self, but that's not exactly accurate. We'll get into that in a moment. The higher self is a separate thing than this whole mind, body, soul. So we have the mind in the mental plane. And we're not talking about your brain here. Yeah? We're not talking about your brain. Your brain is part of your body. We are talking about the flow of information, that is you. You as a thought form. If we want to think of ourselves as a spell, which is actually very helpful in this manner, this is the intent portion of the spell that is you, before the form. Yeah, we have the intent in a spell. In this case, the intent is you. And then we have the form, where all of that intent condenses, all that information condenses down into energy. And we have the astral plane. And on the astral plane, we have what is commonly referred to as the soul. This is our existence on the astral plane. This is the body that we have when we are dreaming, to some extent. Often we are in between the astral plane and our own thoughts in our dreams. So we're not fully into our complete astral form or soul, but the astral realm is where our soul is housed. This is where we become most aware of in between lives, typically. And then below that, we have the material realm and or physical plane. And then we have within that, our self in that is there's two parts. There is the Ka, which is something you've heard me talk about in many videos before. This is an energy produced by the body-soul interaction, because you have your mental plane, your soul, and your body, and each is reaching down into the other and interacting with the other parts of the whole. So between the soul and the body, we have this interaction creating an energy referred to as the Ka. And when we are speaking of our material form, this is often what we're talking about. This is the part of us that would become a ghost. It is our lower soul. Now, our lower soul is connected to the body and interacts with the other part of the material aspect of self. So existence itself is divided into three states. We have the mental plane, where the design is conceived. We have the astral plane, which is the guiding needle of thread. And then we have the material plane, which is the fabric through which the reality of life is woven. And in each one of these steps, we have our existence within these planes as they exist and as they reach down into each other. So let's start with the mental plane. Now, as I said a little while ago, the mental plane is where the thought form that is us, the flow of information that is our very perception, exists on the mental plane. This, if we were to think of ourselves as a spell, this would be the intent aspect of the spell that is being cast. And then we go down to the form on the astral plane. And this is where our soul is. And that's, as I said, the needle reaching down into the astral plane. The mental plane is made up of flow of information. The astral plane is made up of energy. And of course, the material plane is made up of matter. So we have the flow of information condensing, becoming a thread and reaching down into the material plane where our soul is housed. At the top of that aspect of the self, we have that eternal now. That's where this is that we talk about the eternal now. It is that area in between the astral and mental planes. This is where the now is. This idea of higher self, where everything has already occurred. Yeah? The flow of time doesn't exist there. It's hard to talk about the eternal now in words, yeah? But some of you probably know what I'm talking about. We talk about this idea of time as being an illusion, and this is where that is. This is where we have that part of us that we often refer to as the higher self, that we seek guidance from, because this is the aspect of us that has already witnessed all the patterns of information that will occur in our existence as if they are all occurring at the same time. So this is, like I said, the guiding point for the needle reaching down into the astral plane. And then below that we have our typical soul, which is our primary soul, which is where we go in between lives. If you have a pocket reality or a dream platform, this is the aspect of you that should be most in charge at those points. And then reaching down from the astral plane, reaching down towards reality as we pierce through the fabric, we then have the dream self, which is that astral form with just a little bit more of the idea of ego and your brain, as opposed to the mental plane, your brain and thoughts affecting that. And that's where you have these semi-lucid dreams, where you're not quite in your full self, like you are in lucid dreams, where you have complete control of everything. That's the primary soul. When you're like struggling in between, that's that kind of space in between there, the dream self. And then below that, as the energy soul reaches down into the material plane, the next portion of the self is something known as the Ka. I have spoken of the Ka in previous videos. It's the energetic equivalent. It is the part of us that exists on the energetic equivalent of the mental plane, or excuse me, of the material realm. The energetic equivalent of the material realm, the veil, as I've talked about in previous videos, or rift. That part is what that is most connected with that, but it is created by the interaction itself between the soul and your body. There is a energy pattern that is generated from this, creating your ka, which is an aspect of this one lifetime, and it is your ghost, yeah? If you were to become a ghost, this would be the aspect that becomes inflated. This is, in many ways, our material form. It is our lower soul, the part that is interacting with the body. But then, of course, we have the body itself. And we need to learn to interact well with the body because it generates the ka and keeps the whole thing moving. There's no part of this that is less important than the others. Yeah, I mentioned this idea of the higher self, and that's just that one little sliver right there, but he's not more important, or her, it. We don't really have a gender at that point typically, but we tend to refer that as the higher self. Even this aspect is not the most important. It is a good place to guide from. When we are seeking what to do, it is the higher self that we reach to for divination that is in that moment because of perspective. But greater perspective does not mean greater importance, yeah? And in this lifetime, it is perhaps that furnishing of the ka, which is most attached to the ego, creating that we should be the most concerned with, because that's the part that we can only do now. Yeah? After you've lost this body, you're not going to be able to go back and work with that part anymore. Some of them other parts are still going to be there. But in this moment, in this life, it is the ka, the ego, and the body that we are trying to get as much of that full self into so that we can get our own cycle turning, so that we can remember even more of this life in the previous life, in the life after this one, and get that evolution of the self in motion, like I talked about in a previous video about reincarnation. So the more we understand each part of the self and get those in line, the better this is going to work out, and the more powerful we will become as sorcerers. And that's why I talk about it, and that's why we are talking about that, about the idea of the self and the soul in this video, is because that's where we get this momentum of self, that inner strength. The more we can get all aspects of ourselves in line with each other through communication, the better we are going to be at our spellcraft, and the more aware we are going to be of what it is that we want. Yeah, and the more clear our intent is, again, the more cohesive the form of our spells are going to be, and the more cohesive the form is, the greater they can take a charge, and the more efficient they will be in achieving their actual goal and manifesting our will, which we also want to be doing with ourselves, yeah? We want to be manifesting our will in the shape of our ka and in the form of ourself, so that we can get that will going and we can manifest who we wish to be. Okay, so I got a little sidetracked. We were on the ka reacting with the body, and that's why it's important to do the energy work exercises that I've talked about in other videos, where we are getting that energy actually working through the self, channeling into the body, using that belly fire and or some other form of chakra technique. I mean, you don't have to use the belly fire. You can use the traditional chakras or anything like that, but we want to bring that higher self down into the body and allow it to cycle up and through, not putting one aspect above any other. Yeah? They are all of equal importance, and they all have their moment within the cycle. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about this idea of self. I talk about the personal sigil. That is a important connection to this idea. I don't have one on my altar at the moment, but you'll notice in a lot of my previous altars, there is a personal sigil on my altar. You've seen it in quite a few of my videos. There is a reason for that. We want to be connecting to our own higher selves. This is where we become gods. Yeah, I talked about that moment of immortality. This is part of that. This is part of that. Understanding the full self, connecting with the full self, including the higher self, is an important aspect of all of this. So, rather than worshiping a god, worship isn't the right word, but I like to keep a shrine to myself. And I suggest that we all do the same. Yeah, this isn't a, oh, I'm great and wonderful ego inflation thing. Yeah, we're not trying to make ourselves feel wonderful here. We are simply trying to connect with the full self. So, in order to do this, it can be very helpful to create a shrine to the self through the personal sigil. You don't want to take a picture of yourself and put it in a frame, and like offer yourself flowers and milk and honey. That's not what we're going for here. We're talking about the full self, which can be harnessed through the personal sigil and then placed on your altar and simply fed energy and contemplated. And of course, using the other method, the other reasons that we use the personal sigil for, which I discuss in that video. Okay, I think that's going to be it for this episode. Thank you once again for joining us. If you haven't subscribed to the channel, please take the opportunity to do so now. And until next time, bright blessings and an interesting fate. This has been Sorcerer Tal.